I woke up expecting nothing out of the ordinary. A quiet morning, crisp air, maybe a cup of coffee while planning my day. But the second I stepped outside, I knew something was wrong. My yard felt off. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. The grass, the fence, the pathway, everything looked normal. But then my eyes landed on the empty space near my porch. A space that shouldn't have been empty. I froze. Just yesterday, a perfectly stacked pile of firewood had been sitting there, ready for winter. Now, gone. Not a single log left behind. I blinked, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I used more than I thought? No. I remembered stacking it myself, taking my time to make sure it was neat and dry. And yet, it had vanished, every last piece. A strange chill ran down my spine. Who takes firewood? This wasn't some loose trash blowing away in the wind. It wasn't something a dog could drag off. It was an entire stack. Someone had come here, taken it all, and left without a trace. I looked around, expecting to see a fallen log or at least some evidence of a struggle. But there was nothing. No wood chips, no marks, no sign of anything being dragged. Whoever did this had been careful. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. My annoyance hardened into suspicion. Someone had done this on purpose, and there was only one way to find out who. Without wasting a second, I marched back inside and pulled up my security camera footage. I tapped play, expecting maybe a wild animal, some teenagers playing a prank, anything that would make sense. But as the video loaded, my stomach dropped. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. There she was. The one person in this entire neighborhood who thought the rules didn't apply to her. The self-appointed queen of the HOA. Karen. I pressed play on the security footage, half expecting to see some desperate animal dragging off pieces of wood. Maybe a couple of teenagers playing a dumb prank. But as the screen flickered to life, my irritation turned into something much worse. There she was, Karen. Standing tall, arms crossed, radiating that unbearable smugness she was famous for. The self-declared ruler of the HOA. The same woman who had spent years enforcing ridiculous rules, sending out complaint letters about porch decorations, and policing grass heights like it was a full-time job. And now, she had apparently decided that my firewood was her business too. She wasn't even trying to be sneaky. In broad daylight, she marched right up to my neatly stacked pile, waving her hand like some royal decree had been issued. Beside her stood two confused-looking movers, shifting awkwardly as she barked orders at them. One of them hesitated, probably realizing they were stealing, but Karen didn't waver. She pointed at the truck, then at my firewood, and just like that, they started loading it up, log after log, until there was nothing left. She didn't check if anyone was watching, didn't leave a note, didn't act like she had the slightest bit of guilt. Just took what she wanted like she owned the entire neighborhood. My hands clenched into fists as I watched the screen. This wasn't some misunderstanding. She hadn't borrowed a few pieces. She had emptied my entire supply like it was hers to take. And I already knew what she would say if I confronted her. It would be some nonsense about community regulations or aesthetic standards. Maybe she'd throw in a made-up HOA rule to justify it. It was always something with her. I took a deep breath, rage simmering just beneath the surface. This wasn't going to slide. I marched straight to Karen's house, my frustration growing with every step. Her place was impossible to miss. Practically a shrine to the HOA, complete with a flag display that felt more ceremonial than necessary. Even her mailbox looked polished to perfection, as if she personally buffed it every morning. Before I even knocked, the door swung open. There she stood, arms folded, a tight smile on her face. She had been expecting me. "Oh, Jake, what a surprise," she said, her voice dripping with fake cheer. "What can I do for you?" I didn't waste time. "You can start by explaining why you took my firewood." Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew more condescending. "Stole? That's such a harsh word. I prefer to think of it as repurposing." I crossed my arms, my patience already gone. "Repurposing? Karen, that was my firewood. I stacked it. I paid for it. And now it's gone." She sighed, shaking her head as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. Jake, you know as well as I do that the HOA has standards. Your firewood was an eyesore. It didn't align with the visual harmony of the neighborhood. I blinked. Karen, it was in my backyard. No one could even see it. She waved a dismissive hand. That's not the point. The HOA bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra wood. Yours was the most convenient. I let out a sharp laugh. So instead of asking, you just took it? Karen rolled her eyes, already looking bored. Jake, it's just firewood. You're making such a fuss over nothing. You can always get more. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. This was what she did. Twisting things, making people feel like they were overreacting. Like she wasn't the problem. I took a step back, my voice steady. Fine, Karen. Enjoy the firewood. But just know, you made a mistake. She laughed, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. Oh, Jake, always so dramatic. It's just wood. I turned, walking away with a plan already forming in my mind. Karen thought she could take whatever she wanted without consequences. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. I sat in my garage, tapping my fingers against the workbench, letting my anger settle into something far more useful. A plan. Karen had taken my firewood like it was her right. No hesitation, no second thought. She needed to learn a lesson. Something that wouldn't just make her regret it, but would make sure she never tried this nonsense again. I glanced at the empty space where my firewood had been, then at the bonfire announcement sitting on my counter. And that's when it hit me. If Karen wanted to steal from me, I'd make sure she took something she'd never forget. Firewood burns. But what happens if the firewood fights back? A slow grin spread across my face as the idea formed. Fire ants. Tiny, aggressive, and meaner than Karen at an HOA meeting. The moment they felt heat, they'd go into survival mode, crawling, biting, and causing absolute chaos. I grabbed a few spare logs and set to work. First, I carefully hollowed them out, just enough to create space inside, but not enough to make them look tampered with. The outside had to remain completely normal. No cracks, no gaps. Just another ordinary piece of firewood. Next came the stars of the show. I opened the container and watched as hundreds of tiny bodies moved in an angry mass. They were restless, ready. I used a small opening to transfer them inside, making sure they settled deep into the hollowed-out section. Then I sealed the logs back up. Not too tightly, the heat from the fire would do the job for me. The second the flames touched the wood, the ants would panic and pour out in every direction. I tested a few samples to make sure everything worked perfectly. No ants escaped early. The logs blended seamlessly with the rest. It was flawless. Finally, I stacked my new firewood neatly in the exact same spot where the stolen pile had been. I knew Karen too well. If she could steal once, she could steal twice. And this time I was counting on it. I placed the freshly stacked firewood in the exact same spot where my stolen pile had been, making sure everything looked normal. The hollowed logs, packed with my tiny army of fire ants, blended in perfectly. Now all I had to do was wait. With a cup of coffee in hand, I settled by the window, watching the street. It didn't take long. There she was, Karen, standing at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, scanning my property like she was inspecting for violations. The moment her eyes landed on the new pile of firewood, I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Right on cue, she waved over two movers, the same ones from before. She barely even looked at them as she pointed at the logs, already giving orders like she was conducting a military operation. They hesitated, probably remembering the last time they did this. But Karen wasn't one to take no for an answer. With a sharp gesture and a few words I couldn't hear, she had them loading up my wood into the back of a pickup. Again. I sipped my coffee, letting a satisfied smile creep onto my face. Everything was falling into place. Log by log, they emptied my pile, hauling them off like they were performing some grand community service. Karen supervised the entire thing, hands on her hips, nodding in approval. She didn't second-guess it. She didn't stop to consider that maybe, just maybe, this time she should leave well enough alone. And that was the beauty of it. By the time they drove off with the stolen logs, I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. The trap was set. Now, it was only a matter of time. The neighborhood gathered around the towering bonfire, the air filled with the scent of burning wood and the chatter of families enjoying the crisp evening. Kids ran around with marshmallows on sticks, neighbors clinked their cider mugs together, and standing at the very center of it all, soaking up every ounce of attention, was Karen. She clutched the microphone, her voice ringing through the speakers. This event is about unity, about community spirit, and of course, none of this would have been possible without the hard work of your HOA. She placed a hand on her chest dramatically, and a little extra contribution of firewood. I nearly choked on my cider. She really had the nerve. Karen, ever the showwoman, picked up the first log to throw into the flames. She held it up like it was some ceremonial offering, pausing just long enough to make sure everyone was watching. She tossed it in with a flourish. The fire crackled as the wood settled into the flames, the heat licking up the sides. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then it started. A single ant crawled out of the log, confused, scurrying toward the cool air. Then another, and another. Within seconds, a swarm erupted from inside the wood, pouring out in every direction. At first, people barely noticed just a few tiny movements on the ground. But then the mass of fire ants reached Karen's feet. The first bite made her twitch. The second made her yelp. And by the third, she was screaming. Karen flailed wildly, slapping at her arms, legs, and hair as ants climbed up her sleeves, scurried down her back, and swarmed into her perfectly styled bun. Chaos erupted. People jumped from their seats, knocking over drinks and plates. Someone tripped, sending a tray of cider flying. A man swung a chair in panic, missing his target and hitting the snack table instead, sending crackers and marshmallows flying. And then Karen, in a desperate attempt to escape, backed straight into the refreshments table. The massive bowl of hot cider tipped over, soaking her from head to toe. The sticky liquid clung to her clothes, dripped from her hair, and to make matters worse, a bag of marshmallows burst open, some sticking to her cider-soaked sweater like tiny, fluffy polka dots of shame. She shrieked, spinning in circles, trying to shake off the ants, but all it did was make her look even more ridiculous. The HOA vice president, Barbara, called out, "Somebody help her!" But not a single person moved. Karen, realizing she was on her own, did the only thing left. She ran. She sprinted across the grass, arms flailing, voice shrieking about fire hazards and bioterrorism. But there was nowhere to go except the lake. With one final, desperate scream, she leapt into the water. A giant splash echoed through the night. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the first chuckle, then another. Within seconds, the entire neighborhood burst into laughter. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Whispers traveled from porch to porch, text messages flew between group chats, and by noon, the entire street was laughing about Karen's spectacular meltdown. Her usual routine of micromanaging the neighborhood was nowhere to be seen. No morning email reminders about trash bins. No printed notices taped to doors. Not even her usual passive-aggressive glares from across the street. It was like the queen had abandoned her throne. And then, right on schedule, came the desperate attempt at control. An email hit everyone's inbox. Urgent HOA meeting. Attendance mandatory. The subject line was dramatic, even for her. The message itself was worse, packed with phrases like gross misconduct, safety violations, and threats to neighborhood stability. It was obvious what she was doing. She wasn't just trying to save face. She wanted revenge. By the time I arrived at the community center, the room was packed. Neighbors filled every seat. Some leaned against the walls. Others whispered to each other with amused smiles. Karen sat at the front, her usual polished look slightly off. Her hair was still a little frizzy from its unexpected dip in the lake, and her expression was tight with frustration. She cleared her throat, gripping the podium. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We have a serious issue to discuss." Silence. No murmurs of agreement. Just a room full of people waiting to see how far she'd go. She straightened her back, voice sharp. Last night's bonfire was a disaster, a deliberate act of vandalism, and a blatant attack on the HOA. Someone sabotaged the firewood, putting the entire community at risk. And I demand that the responsible party be held accountable. She scanned the crowd, her eyes lingering on me just a little too long. But before she could continue, Barbara, the HOA vice president, spoke up. Karen, before we start blaming people, maybe we should discuss the real issue. Karen frowned. What do you mean? Barbara leaned forward, voice calm but firm. That firewood, you took it from Jake's property. Without permission. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Karen forced a laugh. Oh, please. It was for the benefit of the community. His pile was a violation of aesthetic standards. Barbara raised an eyebrow. You mean the standards that don't actually exist in the HOA guidelines? Karen's mouth opened, then closed. From the back, old Mr. Thompson chuckled. So let me get this straight. You stole his firewood, threw it into the bonfire, and now you're mad because it backfired. Laughter erupted across the room. Karen's face turned red. She tried to regain control, but the spell was broken. Barbara stood. I motion for a vote. Karen stiffened. A vote? Barbara nodded. To remove you as HOA president. Gasps, then nods, then hands shot up all across the room. Karen spun in disbelief. You can't be serious. I have dedicated years to this neighborhood. I have made sacrifices. From the back, someone shouted, Yeah, other people's firewood. The vote was called. The decision was final. Karen was out. She let out an inhuman noise, a mix of outrage and disbelief, before storming out of the meeting. The moment the doors slammed shut behind her, the room erupted into cheers. That night, I sat on my porch, a warm mug in my hands, watching the soft glow of a fire crackling in the pit beside me. The air was crisp, the sky stretched clear above, and for the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Beside me stood a fresh pile of legally owned firewood, stacked just the way I liked it, right where it belonged. No missing logs, no unwanted surprises, no smug HOA dictators claiming ownership over things that weren't theirs. A few neighbors strolled by, grinning, shaking their heads as they sipped their drinks. They didn't need to say much. The look in their eyes, the quiet chuckles, the occasional knowing smirk, it all said enough. We had all endured Karen's reign for too long. The endless notices, the unnecessary fines, the ridiculous rules that seemed to exist just to make people miserable. And now, after years of her controlling everything, she was finally gone. The weight that had hung over the neighborhood had lifted. Someone clinked their bottle against my mug and let out a satisfied sigh. Best HOA meeting I've ever been to. I laughed, tossing another log into the flames, watching the sparks float upward. Karen had spent years taking from people, convinced that she was untouchable. But in the end, she did this to herself. I leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire chase away the last bit of winter's chill. For the first time in years, I murmured to no one in particular, this actually feels like a community again. And this time, it wasn't because of the HOA. It was because she was finally gone.